Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar today. The topic for today's webinar is quantifying the health benefits of clean energy policies with EPA's AVERT and COBRA tools. This webinar is being presented by Clean Energy Group. We have an exciting roster of speakers today. Before I pass it over to them, I'd like to go over a few quick webinar logistics. All of our attendees are in listen-only mode. You have a couple of options to join the audio portion of today's webinar. You can call in via telephone, or you can connect using your computer mic and speakers. If you'd like to minimize your webinar console so that you can view the presentation full screen, you can click on the orange arrow that you see circled there in the picture on your screen. And you can also click on that orange arrow to maximize or expand your webinar console. And one of the things that you might like to do with your webinar console is to submit your questions and your comments. We will be saving some time following our presentation for a Q&A with the audience, and we'll get to as many questions as we can. So do type your questions and comments in as you think of them. A final note, this webinar is being recorded. We will send you an email either today or tomorrow with a link to the webinar recording and a PDF of the slides. And we'll also be posting those on Clean Energy Group's website at cleanegroup.org/webinars. So with that, I'd like to now pass it over to my colleague and today's moderator, Seth Mullendor. Seth is president of Clean Energy Group, and he is going to get us started.
Thank you, Samantha, and thank you to everyone for joining us today. So quick intro for those of you that are not as familiar with Clean Energy Group. We are a national nonprofit, and our mission is to accelerate an equitable and inclusive transition to a resilient, sustainable, clean energy future. We work across a lot of areas to help increase access to clean, distributed, renewable technologies and accelerate the retirement and replacement of polluting fossil fuel infrastructure. In our work, we partner with groups from community-based nonprofits and affordable housing developers to state energy offices and federal national laboratories. So you can learn more about our work at cleanegroup.org, where we have a lot of resources and a lot of other webinars like these, and we'll tell you about some upcoming webinars at the end as well. So with that, I would like to introduce our speakers today. We have the honor of having a couple of folks with us today that are very involved with Environmental Protection Agency's tools, AVERT and COBRA. So first up, we will have Colby Tucker. Colby is a senior policy analyst with the EPA's state and local climate and energy program, where he leads the development of EPA's Avoided Emissions and Generation Tool, or AVERT. Colby joined EPA in 2015, and in his role helps develop and train the public on policy analysis tools relating to air quality, energy, climate, and health. Then we will have David Cooley, who is a senior associate at Abt Associates. He manages Abt's support of the co-benefits risk assessment health impacts screening and management tool, also known as COBRA. He does this for the EPA. Mr. Cooley is an expert in air pollution emissions estimation, emissions inventory development, and public health benefits analysis. In addition to his support for COBRA, he also supports other projects for the EPA, including the National Emissions Inventory and the Emissions and Generation Resource Integrated Database, EGRID. So with that, I'd like to turn things over to Colby, and I do encourage folks to enter questions as we go along, and we'll save hopefully plenty of time to get to them at the end. So, Colby?
Great, thank you so much, Seth. Thank you, Samantha. Thank you everybody for joining us today. I'm very excited to talk to you about two of our tools that we have at EPA called AVERT and COBRA, the Avoided Emissions and Generation Tool, and the Co-Benefits Risk Assessment Health Impacts Screening and Mapping Tool. This is AVERT and COBRA. A brief outline for what we're going to cover today. As I mentioned, we're talking about AVERT and COBRA. Hopefully you come away with being able to answer the what, why, and how AVERT and COBRA work. We'll give you a demonstration of both of these tools, and we will also wrap things up talking about another tool, which is a combination of AVERT and COBRA called the benefits per kilowatt hour. And then we will answer any of the questions that you have in the time remaining. So a quick overview of where we're coming from. This is a shameless pitch for the work that we do in our branch. I'm in the climate energy resources branch. And we have a variety of tools and resources that help stakeholders do the work that they're doing. And so this is a combination of, on the left, our greenhouse gas inventory tools. If you are familiar with the inventory tools, this work to develop these tools occurs in our branch. This can help state governments and local governments track inventory emissions in their regions. We also have the tools that we're talking about today. These are policy analysis tools. We're talking about AVERT and COBRA, and we'll also talk about BPK here in the bottom. And this helps those state governments and local governments do policy analysis, policy scenario analysis, and help make the case for clean energy policies. And we also have communication tools. And so on the right-hand side, you see that we have the greenhouse gas equivalencies calculator. You may have been using this tool without even knowing it. It's embedded in lots of tools in the public domain. And this work also happens in our branch. And you can see here that we have lots of other tools and resources that happen within our branch as well. So I do recommend that you take a look at this page and peruse the websites that we have, which may be helpful for you in your work. So we'll be talking about quantifying the air and health impacts of our energy choices. And so if we look on the left-hand side of this diagram, we can set our energy scenarios looking at energy efficiency or renewable energy. And these would be programs, policies, or specific projects. And we can enter these scenarios into our AVERT tool. And what AVERT is doing at a very high level is estimating the changes in electricity generation. And because of that, estimating the changes of emissions associated with those energy changes. From those energy and emissions changes, we can estimate the air quality impacts of those changes with our COBRA tool. And COBRA will take these criteria pollutants specifically. So we're just looking at PM 2.5, primary PM 2.5, and secondary PM 2.5, which would be NOx, SOx, VOCs, and ammonia. And from that, estimating a dollar impact from the avoided health impacts. And then from that, we'll be looking at our benefits per kilowatt hour, which is a combination of the AVERT energy changes with the COBRA health impacts changes. So the emissions quantification methods can range from basic to sophisticated. You may be familiar with the eGrid tool. This is a basic method, which is a historical database of power sector emissions and power sector generation, and it produces annual emission rates. It has non-base load emission rates, which are similar to the AVERT marginal emission rates, but it also has a variety of other emission rates. But the key here is that it's a basic method where it just has one value for the entire year. We also have sophisticated methods that exist in the public domain. These are very complicated dispatch or capacity expansion models. You may be familiar with models named Plexos or Reeds or Encompass. These models can be very precise, but they can also be very complicated, very difficult to run, and they can be very expensive to run. Right in the middle, we have the AVERT tool. So the AVERT tool sits in between this basic and sophisticated methodologies where we have historical hourly emission rates for the power sector. And so what this does is that this allows us to do specific policy analysis that's looking at a sub-annual level. So we're looking at impacts from an 8,760 hours in a year. And so you can look at load profile changes and see the relative impacts based off of a variety of different policy scenarios. Why would we want to use AVERT? Well, very simply, the AVERT tool seeks to quantify the emission impacts of EE and RE. The tool was built to answer this quantification question, where we know that energy efficiency and renewable energy yields emissions reductions, but quantifying it can be very complicated. And so the AVERT tool helps answer this question of just how much emissions would be avoided if you add energy efficiency or renewable energy to your grid. And so it can calculate these avoided emissions, and it can do it on a variety of regional scales, a grid region, a state, or a county. And specifically, we're looking at CO2 and 5 different criteria pollutants. This is NOx, SOx, PM 2.5, ammonia, and VOCs. And these, as I mentioned before, are the inputs to COBRA. We can also compare emission impacts of a variety of different programs. So if you are evaluating an energy efficiency program, if you are considering different levels of renewable energy, whether it's offshore wind, onshore wind, utility scale solar, what have you, these different scenarios can be evaluated in AVERT. You can stack scenarios, you can combine them, and you can do very refined analyses on an hourly basis. AVERT is also useful in an air quality context. It has been peer reviewed and is allowed to be accredited in a SIP context. So if you are in a state or region that is in non-attainment, you can use AVERT to help quantify the emissions reductions from energy efficiency and renewable energy. And we have an example of that here with the Arkansas Regional Haze SIP. And importantly, AVERT is a near-term projection tool. It has a 5-year time horizon from the base year that you are using. The data that is in our web tool and that you can download on our website are in the 2021 year. And so you can use that from 5 years from 2021. And the reason for this is that it is based off of historical data. And so there is no changes to the power sector looking forward, but it is has a 5-year time horizon into the future. So to get you doing a little bit of thinking too, I have a quick poll question here, which is just to think about our power sector a little bit more. And so Samantha, please begin the poll, which is a question that reads, what type of electricity generator produced the second most electricity in 2021? And this, of course, is for the United States. So the poll is open. Please take a moment to enter your guess, and then we will take a look at the results and move on with the presentation. So we'll just leave this open for another 10 seconds or so. Enter a guess. And we can take a look at the results. I can't actually see how many people have entered results, but I will. All right, we're now looking at the results. Very good. So the answer to our poll question is that it is coal. In 2021, natural gas was the highest generator, followed by coal, just slightly beating out renewables and nuclear. But I will say that over the last 3 years, this has not always been the case. In 2020, renewables outpaced coal for the first time in history. And you can see that the renewables generation is increasing from 2019 to 2021. And so we are on an upward trend with renewables, and renewables are beginning to play a larger and larger role in our power sector. And you can still see that natural gas is the dominating generator in the United States. But this is an important part of how we can understand our grid. So all of these different generators, putting them together, make up our grid and make up the emissions impacts of our grid. And so this slide here, you can see is an idealized grid. It's one day of the year. On the left, it's midnight, and on the right is midnight. And over the course of the day, our energy demand follows this red line. And so you can see at night, we have lower energy demand, and towards the middle and end of the day, we increase our energy demand. And because of this, we require different energy generators. You can see that at the middle of the day, we have solar coming online, but we also have increased demand, and so we have other power plants that are that come online in order to meet the full demand. And so when we're thinking about AVERT, we're trying to combine our renewables, combine energy efficiency programs to help understand what the impact is on this grid mix. If we're thinking about this, we can think about this in two ways. We can think about this from an average emissions perspective, or we can think about this from a marginal emissions perspective. Showing you here, if we were to look at the dotted red line, look at all of the generators, add all of the generation up, look at all of the emissions profiles, add them all up and divide one by the other, that would look at the average emissions rate of that particular hour. But if we think that the top generator is coming online just to meet that last unit of demand, we can think about this from a marginal perspective too. And so if we add an energy efficiency program, or if we add more renewable energy, we can ask the question, if not for this energy efficiency, or if not for this renewable energy, then this power plant would not have needed to come on. And so we can look at the emissions profile of this last generator called the marginal generator, which is the emissions profile that we seek to estimate in AVERT. Another way of thinking about this, we have these graphs aligned here. So on the top, we have this standard before scenario where we have different power plants coming online, which is the different shadings, and you can see that it's increasing and decreasing over the course of the day. If we have generation from renewables, we can see that it takes a slice out of this this profile, which has a variety of different generators that it is replacing. And then in the bottom, we can look at the displaced generation, and we can apply an emissions profile, knowing what each of these generators would have otherwise emitted at these different levels. And so again, this is what AVERT is seeking to estimate and calculate in its emissions results. So specifically, a little more detail on how does it work. Well, we get raw hourly generations data from another EPA database. This is the Air Markets Program, which collects hourly data on power generators, fossil generators, over the course of the year. Moving to the right, we put this data into a statistical module that seeks to answer, if we change generation a little bit, which power plants would be turning off and which power plants would be turning on, whether you're increasing demand or decreasing demand. And from this statistical analysis, we produce regional data files. And the regional data files are what most users will be working with. And so you would pick your region on the right, and you would enter it into the AVERT main module, and you would then start using your different scenarios, whether that's energy efficiency, renewables, or what have you. I would like to highlight here that you can make changes to this, to your regional data file. If you look to the bottom left, we have this future year scenario template, and that is available for users who are interested in, say, retiring certain power plants that are on the grid, or adding future power plants that you think might come onto the grid. And so this helps refine analyses that users might have. I will say that you have to run it through the statistical module, and you would do that on your own and produce a new regional data file to then run it through your scenario. We won't be talking much more about the future year scenario today, but there is more information in the user manual, and we do have training on our websites. I'd be happy to answer any questions you have about that. But I will say that we are looking at the box here today, thinking about the regional data files and the main module. So without further ado, we'll jump straight into a demonstration here. And the scenario that I'm going to be asking is, what if New York, the state of New York, increased its energy efficiency by 1.1%? What would be the annual emissions impacts? So we have two AVERT tools, actually. We have one that is a web tool and one is that an Excel edition. And so where I am now is at epa.gov/AVERT. You can see all of the information here, and we have our web tools here and the Excel edition here. So I will click on the web edition, and it will bring us to our tool. And the first thing that you will be presented with here is that you can select a region or you can select a state. Now, before I click here, you can see that our regions are broken out into 14 different regions. And this is representative of the different RTOs or ISOs, the regional transmission operators or the independent service operators that help deliver our power. And so here in the Mid-Atlantic, this is PJM, and we're thinking about New York, and then here's New England, etc. But you can see that some of these regions cross over state boundaries. And so if you're interested in doing a state level analysis that is in a state that crosses boundaries, you can select your state here. And what is happening is that AVERT would be running multiple regions in the background. But fortunately for our example today, we just have simple New York, which is represented by the full state of New York. So from there, we can set our energy scenario. And again, we're working in the New York region, and we're presented with 4 different options. We can set an energy efficiency scenario where we have annual generation reduced by a certain amount, hourly generation reduced by a certain amount. We can have a % reduction, which is what we'll be doing, but not just yet. We also have wind. So if you're adding onshore wind or offshore wind, you can add those here. And we have solar, where you have utility solar or distributed solar. And what this is doing for each of these is that it's changing the load profile that would be inputted into the module. So we're going to be doing a targeted program. We're going to be reducing generation by 1.1% during the peak 100% of hours. And we will calculate this. And you can see that this is the profile, the 8760 profile that will be changed in AVERT. I do want to say that this is a neat way to say target certain hours of the year. If you only want to look at the top 5% of hours, you can do that, 50% of hours, and so forth. But we're going to be looking at a energy efficiency program that looks at reducing the top 100 hours by 1.1%. So I can hit here and get results. And this is going to take a second to run. I've actually already rerun this. And so when that's done running, it would look like this. And so we have our results here. You can see that we have a few different data outputs. You can see our different pollutants here. We have NOx, SOx, NOx, ozone season NOx, CO2, PM, VOCs, and ammonia. And here, in the EERE impacts, these would be the emissions reductions associated with this scenario. This is an annual displacement. So for the first year, this is what the results would be. And then for the first 5 years of the scenario, this would be the annual emissions reductions. A couple of other things to note is that we have a marginal fossil rate here, and then this is the average fossil rate. And so you can see in New York that the marginal fossil units have a higher emission rate than the average fossil units. So every electricity or every kilowatt hour, every megawatt hour saved is reducing a little bit more emissions than, say, the average fossil unit. We can look at these results in a few different geographical contexts. We have region, we have state, where you could pick New York. This is mostly New York, but if you had a larger region, you might have different states of interest. And then you can also look at specific counties. One thing to note is that if you're looking for a specific county, you might not see it in here, and that's because that specific county might not have a power plant in the AVERT database. So you can see here that these are all of the counties that are in the AVERT database that has a power plant that's being affected. So we could take a look at, say, Rensselaer County. And so you're looking at the emissions changes from the power plants in Rensselaer County. We have the emissions profiles for each of the pollutants here, and this is over the course of certain months. And so if you're interested in, say, summertime months, you can take a look at just, say, a few months. And while we won't be talking about COBRA just yet, I do want to highlight that we have the Submit Results button here in AVERT. And so this is a very easy way to transport the results from the AVERT tool into the COBRA tool. I also like to highlight that you can download this data such that if you wanted to play with it on your own, that you could. One thing that I will say is that there is slightly different functionality between the web edition and the Excel edition. So when you download this data from the web tool, you'll only be downloading county level results. But if you're playing with the Excel tool, you'll have a little more functionality. Let's take a quick look at the Excel tool. So the Excel tool will look and feel very similar to the web tool, but there are a few key differences that are worthy of pointing out in case you're interested in having more specific data. There's a little more functionality in the Excel tool that doesn't exist yet in the web tool. So one thing I want to point out is that you can click this little gray button here, and we will pop up a few different tabs. You will pop up all of the tabs at the bottom, and that can help maneuver through and see different options that you have. So that's one thing to note. This here is very similar, where you are selecting the region. So this is the same map. You select the different region. You would enter your region into the file path, and then you would click load. I've already loaded the New York region, so I won't do that. That would take a minute or two, but we can click next. This here, again, looks very similar to what we're looking at in the web tool. We have the same ability to enter energy efficiency programs here, whether it's a percent change or a flat change. And we have the different scenarios here that you can stack on top of your energy efficiency. But one thing that's different in the web, different from the web tool, is that you can enter detailed hourly data. So if we click here, you can enter your own manual profile here. And so this might be, if you're interested in a more specific type of profile, only certain hours, maybe you're targeting, say, a peak load from a specific program that you know that isn't well represented in one of the default tools, or if you're interested in understanding, say, batteries that might have an increase to load, you can have increases or decreases to the profile here. And again, you can only do this in the Excel tool, not in the web tool. The same goes for, say, other electrification options. You can increase load here, but I will say that any electrification option that you include, be it electric vehicles or building electrification, should also include the offset emissions from those other end uses. And so we only have power sector here, so user beware. And then lastly, what I'd like to point out, and this will be a little burly, but we have data here on every power plant. So in the web tool, we only have data that looks at different counties, but here, if you're interested in specific changes to specific power plants, you can tab over to these blue tabs and have specific power plant level changes. And so just wanted to highlight that if you're interested in looking at individual power plants and how individual power plants might be responding to your scenarios. So as you can see, there's a lot more functionality in this tool, lots of different options for looking at results, lots of different options that you can play with for scenario analysis. But I will leave AVERT there for now, and we will take a look at COBRA. So I will pass this over to David.
Great. And have I successfully unmuted myself? Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Yes.
Great, thanks. All right, so to go back into the presentation, let me, oops, went too far. Let me skip down. Okay, so COBRA. So, Colby just walked through the AVERT tool that talks about the change in air pollution and greenhouse gas emissions from the electricity sector from energy efficiency and renewable energy projects and policies. And so what the output of AVERT gives you is a change in emissions. What I'll be talking about is the COBRA tool. COBRA is the Co-Benefits Risk Assessment Health Impact Screening and Mapping Tool, COBRA. And what COBRA does is it kind of takes the next step, which is when you have a change in air pollution emissions, how does that impact ambient air quality, and then ultimately how does that impact health outcomes associated with changes in air quality. So COBRA is a free, easy to use, peer-reviewed screening model, and what it does is it estimates county level changes in health outcomes from changes in criteria air pollutants that affect PM 2.5 concentrations. And I'll sort of unpack that in a second. But the other thing that it does is there's a monetary value associated with the changes in health outcomes. And so it can give you kind of a bottom line dollar value of the kind of the overall benefits or costs, depending on which scenario you run, of these kind of changes in air pollution scenarios. And then the results that come out of the tool are shown in sort of summary tables and maps that kind of facilitate the visualization of the results. So in terms of how COBRA works, and we'll do a demo of this to kind of walk through it, but the inputs to the COBRA tool are changes in air pollution emissions. And there's really 5 pollutants that are inputs into COBRA. That's either primary or directly emitted fine particulate matter, or PM 2.5. And then there are also precursors to PM 2.5 pollution that react in the atmosphere to form PM 2.5, and that's SO2, NOx, ammonia, and VOCs. So for those of you that aren't familiar with what PM 2.5 is, it's an air pollutant that is either directly emitted from smokestacks or tailpipes, or like I said, it forms in the atmosphere from reactions of other pollutants, and it is a extremely fine air pollutant particle that when you breathe it in can result in a host of health impacts, including respiratory issues, cardiovascular issues, and even premature mortality. So it is kind of, in terms of health impacts from air pollution, it is sort of kind of the main culprit in terms of the adverse health effects that we see from air pollution. And so what COBRA does is when you can enter in changes in emissions of these different pollutants in a certain location, and then it includes in it sort of a reduced form air quality model that says, okay, if we've changed air pollution emissions in a certain county or a group of counties, how is that going to impact air quality, not only in those counties where you've emitted the air pollution, but in all the surrounding counties as well? It takes into account the fact that air pollution is going to spread out and get moved around in the atmosphere through atmospheric transport. So then what it'll do is say, okay, you've changed the air pollution emissions in a certain county. How does that impact the overall air quality, ambient air quality concentrations in the region, surrounding where the emissions have been changed? And then once we know the change in air quality, then the next step is we calculate the change in the health outcomes. And so there are these kind of statistical relationships between change in particulate matter, air quality levels, and certain health outcomes, so that as PM levels are reduced, you'll have reductions in premature mortality, reductions in hospitalizations, reductions in people going to the emergency room for asthma, lost work and school days, things like that. So there are changes in COBRA models, how those reductions in particulate matter result in changes in those health outcomes. And then finally, like I said, the COBRA has a dollar value from sort of the standard economic literature that, and this is values that EPA uses and its analyses of air pollution policies, the value that we place on avoiding these health outcomes. So COBRA puts a sort of a dollar value on each of these health outcomes and then kind of sums it up to give you a total economic value of the policy that you've been analyzing. And then it outputs those results and it gives you the results at the county level. So you can look at for every county, what are the benefits of these reductions in air pollution emissions. So in terms of the overall health effects that are included in COBRA, it estimates the change in incidence and the change in economic value for 12 different health outcomes. So that's adult mortality, infant mortality, non-fatal heart attacks, respiratory emissions, hospital admissions for respiratory and cardiovascular diseases, acute bronchitis, upper and lower respiratory symptoms, and then asthma exacerbation. So this is just the symptoms of asthma, as well as actually having to go to the emergency room for asthma. And then what we call minor restricted activity days. Those are kind of like the days where they would say, this is a air quality alert day, you shouldn't go outside, those kind of things. And then finally, work loss days. So again, COBRA has statistical equations to say, with the change in air quality resulting from changes in air pollution emissions, how is that going to affect each one of these health outcomes? If you have improved air quality, you're going to have reduced mortality, you're going to have reduced heart attacks, reduced hospital admissions, and we have functions in the tool that estimate, what is quantify what is that change, and then put a dollar value on that. In terms of how COBRA has been used, so we're talking today about how COBRA has been coupled with the AVERT tool that Colby's been talking about, and that's definitely a very important use case for COBRA, is analyzing how changes in emissions from the electricity sector, what are the health impacts of those. But COBRA is not just an energy tool. It can really kind of analyze any sector of the economy, and it's been used that way in many places. So there's, as of this past February, there were more than 130 citations of papers that have used COBRA, and it's from things like state level climate action plans that look at emission reductions in basically every sector, renewable energy policies and energy efficiency policies. So those are, things like what AVERT does, but also things like transportation policies, and even things like the impacts of prescribed fires and benefits of urban tree planting, and different types of analyses in almost any sector that you can, basically if it's a sector that results in air pollution emissions, you can analyze it in COBRA to say, well, what are the benefits of reducing air pollution in that sector. And so on that note, actually, let's see if I can do this. I'll go to, there was a paper that came out just actually earlier this week, and it was mentioned in the Washington Post that cutting air pollution from fossil fuels would save 50,000 lives a year. This is a study done by the University of Wisconsin at Madison, and they analyzed basically what are the basic impacts of fossil fuel in the United States, and they used COBRA to do this analysis and said, if you were to zero out fossil fuel emissions, you would save about 50,000 lives per year, and the economic value of that is on the order of $600 billion per year. So this is a study that just came out that used COBRA to analyze this kind of large scale number. But the sort of demo that we will do now is a much smaller scale. It's just kind of feeding off of the demo that Colby just showed from the AVERT policy, which is energy efficiency, improving energy efficiency by 1.1% in New York State. So, you know, he ran AVERT and got the change in air pollution emissions, and then all you really need to do to take that data and get it into COBRA is click this button, submit results to COBRA. And what that will do is bring up the COBRA tool, which I will switch to now. So this is the COBRA tool. Like AVERT, COBRA has both a web edition and that's a little more streamlined, and then a sort of more fully functional, has some additional functions in a desktop version that you can download and install on your computer. I'll be focusing on the web edition today. But so, you know, this is the web edition. You can get to it from EPA's website. It's cobra.abt.cloud.gov. And so I'll just kind of walk you through how to run COBRA and then go over the results of the scenario that Colby ran. So one thing is the scenario that we're talking about here, we ran AVERT and then clicked a button to push the results into COBRA and ran COBRA that way. That's definitely one way to run COBRA. Another way to do it is just to start with COBRA. So if you're not using AVERT, you can just open COBRA and start using it. And the way you would do that is you would first kind of build your scenario. So you'd select your location. Where are the emission reductions taking place? You can enter those at the state level or at the county level, and say, you know, these are the locations where we're going to have emission reductions. And then you select your sector. And so, you know, for something that is changing emissions in the electricity sector, like AVERT models, you would select the fuel combustion electric utility sector. But as I mentioned before, there are COBRA includes basically every sector. So things like highway vehicles, the industrial sector, waste disposal, and even, you know, natural resources. So there have things like your wildfires and things like that. So it, you know, it sort of is up to you whatever sector you want to analyze. But for the electricity sector, this is the one you would choose. And there are also subsectors if you want to. These are optional, but you give you even finer grain results. So you're saying, you know, maybe this policy is and affects emissions in the electricity sector, but not every facility. Maybe it's really just the coal facilities or things like that. So you can do subsectors there, and then you enter your changes and emissions. So this would give you you would enter in changes in PM 2.5, SO2, NOx, ammonia, and VOCs. And you can enter in reductions, or you can enter in increases if you want to run a scenario that results in an increase in air pollution emissions. And you can enter it in as just tons of emissions. So if your policy is going to reduce PM by 100 tons, you would just enter that in here. Or you can say this is going to just reduce a % of the baseline. So whatever the baseline emissions are in that location that you've selected, you could say, reduce it by 10% or something. So then once you've entered your emission reductions, and I should state that you don't have to enter it in for every single pollutant. So maybe you only have data on PM and NOx, but you don't have it on SO2, ammonia, and VOCs. That's fine. COBRA can handle that. And then once you've entered that, you would click Add to Scenario, and it would show you kind of the results. This shows you what you've entered into COBRA. And so, like Colby mentioned, he ran AVERT and he clicked a button, and all of that AVERT results got automatically pushed into COBRA. So you don't actually have to enter anything here, which is nice because otherwise you'd have to be hand entering every single one of these counties. So you'd say, Yates, New York, enter in 0.17 tons of PM, 0.03 tons of SO2, and so on and so forth. Hit add to scenario. Then Wyoming, New York, enter in these different, emission inputs, hit add to scenario, and you would do that over and over again for every single county and kind of build your scenario that way. There was a time before AVERT and COBRA were as tightly integrated where we would have to kind of manually hand enter county level data like that, and it was kind of a pain. And so that's why we developed that integration where you can just click the button, it takes the AVERT results and pushes it right into the tool. That said, if you're looking at emission reductions from other sectors that are not covered by the AVERT tool, so anything like highway vehicles or the industrial sector or waste, you have to still hand enter things into COBRA. And so that you would do that over here. And you can also, I should say, layer on additional sectors on top of this. So we've pushed in our AVERT results, and let's say at the same time that have this energy efficiency scenario in COBRA, we also want to look at changes in emissions in the highway vehicle sector. You could add that here, and so just select a location, select the highway vehicle sector, and enter your emissions over here. And then once you've kind of built your scenario, you've got everything that you want in COBRA, then you will click Run Scenario, and Colby's already run it. It takes about a minute for COBRA to run, and then it comes up with the results. So this scenario that we ran in AVERT and then ran through COBRA of increasing energy efficiency by 1.1%. Has a total health effects in dollars of $17 million to $38 million, and this is annual. So this is a 1 year estimate of the health benefits. And then you can see it broken down by all the different health outcomes. So one thing to note is that avoiding mortality. So this is avoiding 1.5 to 3.5 premature deaths, basically, and here's the dollar value associated with that, and then the cases of other health outcomes that we'll be avoiding are here, changes in incidence, and then the dollar value associated with that, and then there's the total value associated with it, and then down here there's a map, and like I said before, that even though the emissions were changed really just in counties in New York, the COBRA accounts for the fact that some of that air pollution is going to spread out and have impacts in other counties, other states outside of New York, and really kind of depending on the size of your intervention, it could really have impacts across the whole country. And so you can zoom in and click on certain counties. So like this is in Nassau County in Long Island. The total health benefits will be $1.6 million in Nassau County, and you can look at different outcomes here. So like in Nassau County, it would avoid 0.15 cases of avoided mortality. A question always comes up: how do you avoid less than like a whole number of mortality? And I think want to point out that what COBRA is doing is analyzing change in risk of mortality. So it's not necessarily saying it's saying 1.1 to 3 people will avoid 1 to 3 avoided mortalities. That's not like definitely that's the number of people that are going to avoid premature death, but it's changing the risk such that on average we would expect that number of people to have the avoided number of mortalities. So that is COBRA in a nutshell, and then I will hand it back to Colby to talk about the benefits per kilowatt hour tool.
Great, thanks, David. I will take the keyboard back, go back to the slides. So what we've seen so far is a pathway between understanding changes in energy efficiency and renewable energy, putting them through AVERT, where it changes our estimated generation and associated emissions. We put that through COBRA, where it changes air quality across the surface of the United States. It then changes the health incidence and has an associated dollar value. The last thing we're going to talk about is this benefits per kilowatt hour, which takes a standardized AVERT run and standardized COBRA runs, puts them together to have a per kilowatt hour level of benefit. And so what BPK for short, essentially is that it's a bunch of regional factors. And so from standardized scenarios that we've put through AVERT and put through COBRA, we've created a spreadsheet of values that helps estimate on a per kilowatt basis what the value is. What is the health benefit? What is the benefit value of these different project types or policy types? And so we've broken it down to the 6 different scenarios that exist in AVERT, that uniform energy efficiency, that energy efficiency at peak, different utility solars and distributed solar, onshore and offshore wind for those regions that have access to offshore wind. And you can see that we have both the low estimate and the high estimate, which you saw in the COBRA tool, which is reflecting different levels of estimated mortalities. And then we also have a few different discount rates. So we have a 3% discount rate, we have a 7% discount rate. I will say that in the COBRA tool, there's also a specific discount rate that you can enter if you want to modify it. Certain utilities or certain programs might have a pre-anointed discount rate that you would want to put in. But for our standard policies and the defaults here, we have the 3% discount rate and the 7% discount rate reflecting future savings from avoided mortalities. So the BPK technical report is a technical report. I wouldn't call this necessarily a tool in the same way that AVERT and COBRA have dynamic inputs and outputs. This is mostly a spreadsheet that you can see, a part of here, but it is a methodology. And so I'd like to highlight that the technical report seeks to establish a methodology where people who are interested in understanding this BPK style value, it offers a methodology for how you could create your own BPK for your specific scenarios or for your specific regions if it's not perfectly aligned with the AVERT regions. I will say that the BPK regions are the same as the AVERT regions, perhaps for obvious reasons, but there are only 14 regions here. So if you're interested in creating a BPK for your state that isn't perfectly aligned with, say, the New York State, you could create your own BPK for your state using the methodology here. And just to highlight this and drive the point home, what we're talking about with AVERT, COBRA, and BPK is really just one slice of the benefits of energy efficiency and renewable energy. And I really like this idea of the layer cake that the regulatory assistance projects put together, where you can understand that there are a variety of different benefits that might come from these energy efficiency or renewable energy programs. And in AVERT and COBRA, we can estimate these energy changes, we can estimate these emission changes, and we can look at the health benefits and the economic benefits associated with that. And that's really important because a lot of these values we know not to be zero. And so when we're going through these evaluations of cost benefit and we're not able to estimate a health benefit, it would be entered as 0. And we know that's not true. And so the AVERT and COBRA and BPK analytical pipeline helps us come up with estimates for these cost benefit analysis. And you can see that from this example from RAP and this layer cake that it is just one small subset of these cost benefits. And so just to drive the point home that AVERT and COBRA can help estimate this hard to estimate value of what these health impacts and health benefits are. And one thing that I'd like to touch on as well is that because of AVERT's geographic representation of power plants and how generation emissions change, and because of the surface, the air quality surface and demographic data that is in COBRA, we can do geographic analyses, spatial analyses of the impacts of these different scenarios. And what this can help us understand is potential environmental justice considerations. It's not perfect, I'll admit. The spatial resolution of AVERT and COBRA are really just at the county scale, and that is in many ways insufficient to understand fully environmental justice considerations. But it is, again, better than nothing. So you have an understanding of what the spatial changes from certain policies might have, at least on a county level basis. So I would encourage you to consider those sorts of analyses as well if you're using our AVERT and COBRA analyses. So we have plenty of time for questions. I know we allotted 90 minutes for this, and we have a few more minutes left in the time allotted. So I do welcome lots of questions, but that is all we have for our materials that we had planned to present to you today.
Great. Thank you, Colby and David. I hope that all of our attendees found this as fascinating as I did. We do have a lot of questions, so I'm glad that we have a lot of time here. So I'll just jump on into them. The first one I'm going to ask, it comes from an attendee in Alaska. And basically the question is, what about Alaska? I imagine anybody from Hawaii is thinking the same thing. So is it available for the non-contiguous US? If not, is that going to be added?
It's a very good question. Unfortunately, at this time, for the AVERT tool and for COBRA, Alaska and Hawaii are not represented in these tools. We are always improving these tools. We do hope to expand functionality and expand regional representation of in our tools, but at this time, unfortunately, we do not have Alaska or Hawaii represented.
All right. Well, sorry, Alaska and Hawaii, but to come soon, hopefully. A question in general: is the code behind these open source?
Yes, the AVERT is open source. COBRA is open source. These are available for download on our websites. The codes for AVERT exist in a couple of different formats. So the main module is an Excel spreadsheet. And so for those of you who are familiar with VBA, familiar with macros, understanding how the regional data files are moving through your inputs and outputs, all of that is easily seen in Excel. Regarding the statistical methodology, that is a MATLAB code. And so for those of you who are clever with MATLAB, you can dig into it there. But that is a little bit more difficult to access, but we'd be very happy to share any code if you're interested in understanding how the statistical module works. I can also say that a highlighted version of how it works exists in our user manual. So if you're interested in sort of understanding it and not necessarily digging into it, you can look at the user manual to understand how the statistical methodology works. And if you're interested in digging into the statistical methodology and seeing it for yourself, you'll have to use MATLAB to do that. Regarding COBRA.
This question actually, they had asked specifically about MATLAB. So I'll be happy to hear that.
Okay. Was the question also related to COBRA's accessibility?
I think folks would be interested in that. And I can also say for COBRA specifically, there was a question about the documentation of the methodology for the monetary valuations, if that was available, or if folks could access the statistical methodology behind those calculations. So you're on mute, David.
Yeah, right. There you go. I can answer that one. So the yes, the COBRA is really fully documented in terms of the economic values associated with the health outcomes and the sort of the functions that we use to estimate the change in health outcomes. So those functions, which we call concentration response functions, so change in particulate matter concentrations results in a response of different health outcomes. Those all come from peer-reviewed literature on sort of epidemiology of changes in health outcome from changes in air quality, and so we use that to kind of model the health outcomes in COBRA, and those are all documented in the user manual that goes along with COBRA, and it's on EPA's website. And in terms of the dollar values, those also either come from the peer-reviewed economic literature, or it comes from some data on sort of the cost of certain health outcomes, like the cost of hospitalizations and the cost of emergency room visits. Sort of one of the more well-known, I guess, health economic values is what we call the value of a statistical life. That's the value of avoided mortality, and it tends to dominate the total dollar values. That's a value that EPA has been using for many years, and it's really kind of an average of 26 different studies to analyze the health impacts of that, and that's all discussed in the COBRA Users Manual.
Great. Related question to that: how often are those numbers updated, and are the monetary values based on a specific year?
Yeah, great question. So they are updated semi-regularly. I mean, one of the things that there are several inputs that go into COBRA. That COBRA comes kind of pre-baked with some data that it needs data on what are the baseline emissions, what are the the population in each county, and then what are the economic values of those things. We update COBRA, I'd say roughly every 2 to 3 years with new data as it comes out, and when we do that, we always update it with the latest available data that we have on emissions, population valuation, and so what that includes is the valuation data. Some of it takes into account the growth in income. So as people have higher incomes, they're they're more willing to avoid certain health outcomes, and so we place a higher value on those health outcomes. And so the last time we updated COBRA was in the summer of 2020, so about 2 years ago. So that's we do update it as regularly as we can.
Related to that, there was a question specifically about if COVID changed the health impact functions. If it was done 2 years ago, maybe not.
Yeah, so no, it has not been formally integrated into COBRA, and that's definitely something worth looking at. But at this time, COBRA does not take into account anything from COVID, and just the state of the science on these concentration response functions. It may be a little while before it gets settled enough to where we have these well-defined functions about how COVID is impacting those health outcomes.
Thanks. Colby, a couple of specific questions. One person wondered if AVERT could assess adding or subtracting biomass for electricity generation.
That's a good question. Unfortunately, I don't think that it can. So the data sets that AVERT leverages comes from EPA's Clean Air Markets Division, and I do not believe that biomass plants are collected, are captured in that data set. So that means two things. One is that that's not captured in sort of the baseline values for AVERT, and it's also not able to be represented in the future year statistical module. So it's a hard thing to model. I would want to double check that just to make sure that there's not a biomass plant that for some reason is captured in the Clean Air Markets Division database. So that person, I would welcome you to follow up with me after it, and I can get a firm answer on that.
Great, and this actually came from the same person asking specifically about a state like Vermont, where only a fraction of the electricity is actually generated within the state. So what would be a recommended way for a place like Vermont to talk about how to use AVERT's tool to look at their generation mix impacts?
Yeah, Vermont's an interesting test case, given that a lot of that power is imported from Canada, and so that power is not represented in AVERT explicitly, although it is implicitly included in that the statistical module takes into account those power plants that are responding to load and generators that are happening to that grid. So while it's not explicit as represented as Canadian imports, for example, that is load that is not necessarily needed to be responded to by the generators that are in the region. Regarding transmission and distribution constraints throughout New England, and then I guess also to Canada, the New England region and for each region, in AVERT for that matter, is modeled as an island unto itself. And so the power plants in the New England region, the power plants in the New York region, and all regions operate in, I'll say unison. They're operating together as load is changing and as the statistical module is predicting that individual power plants might be increasing load or decreasing load based off of the scenario that you've inputted. So regarding a specific state that is within a larger region like Vermont, there isn't a great way just to look at Vermont's individual power plants. What you could do, and what I would recommend you do, is to look at the New England region and to make the changes that you're interested in and see how Vermont power plants are changing, and know that if there are small enough changes to your scenario that are local enough, that transmission and distribution constraints aren't explicitly represented in AVERT, and so that the results may or may not perfectly represent what's happening, but it is a screening level model that can give you a sense of what's happening for individual power plants throughout the region.
Okay, and this is related actually to the transmission and distribution constraints. It sounded like maybe AVERT doesn't take those into account. There was a question about if you're adding renewable capacity, does it take into account curtailments due to those types of constraints, or even demand constraints when there's over generation?
Yeah, so a couple of things on that. The transmission and distribution losses are included. So there is a factor of, say, if you're having an energy efficiency program, there is an adder of transmission distribution loss that is added to the value of energy efficiency, for example, because that is not a generator that has to transmit electricity and then is lost in transmission lines. So that is an added value for energy efficiency in the model and for rooftop solar as well. I don't think that was the question, though. I think the question was understanding curtailments. So again, there is not an explicit curtailment, and curtailments are not represented in the model. The model is only looking at fossil generators and the impact that renewables or energy efficiency might have on those fossil power plants. So any curtailment that you would be interested in modeling, you could model that if you had an understanding of what the added renewables curtailment might be. And so you could go into the enter your own user profile, or enter your own 8760 profile and modify what you think your renewable profile might look like for certain hours of the day. So if you're in California and you're adding solar to your scenario, and you know that 10% of daylight hours are being curtailed, for example, you could modify that if you wanted.
Got it. Let's see. Question for David. There's a question about whether a COBRA is this seems like a good way to quantify, the effects of certain policies, but can it also be used to look at differences in historical data, say comparing, health impacts from 2020 versus 2021?
So COBRA comes preloaded with data for certain years, and so that's I mentioned that COBRA has a web edition and it has a desktop edition that has a little bit more functionality. The desktop edition is one you have to download and install on your computer, and it comes preloaded with data for 3 years, 2016, and then projections for 2023 and 2028. And so those, that means is those are data sets that include what the baseline air pollution emissions are, the population, data on the baseline health incidents, and then the value based on people's income. Just given the availability of data that we have on things like air pollution emissions, we kind of only have those 3 years. And then in the web edition, we really only have one of those years, this year 2023. So it's really kind of analyzing a snapshot in time of the air pollution, the health impacts of changes in air pollution emissions. That said, if you wanted to look at changes over time in air pollution emissions in COBRA, you could say like, okay, here's what the emissions were in 2020, here's what they are in 2021, 2022, and enter those into COBRA and kind of analyze the change in emissions over time that way. The desktop edition also gives you the ability to change the underlying data sets, like if you had data on population from different years and things like that, and the user's manual explains kind of how to import those into COBRA. But by and large, COBRA is kind of really a snapshot in time that you can use to analyze emissions from annual benefits from 1 year of changes in emissions.
Thanks. Does the COBRA account for indoor air quality and time spent indoors?
Not explicitly. So COBRA is really focused on outdoor air quality, so changes in emissions from sources outdoors, and how that impacts ambient air quality and how that then impacts health outcomes from people's exposure to ambient air quality. So it doesn't take into account how that might change indoor air quality directly. That said, things that I've seen in some of the published literature is that one of the bigger drivers of indoor air quality is outdoor air quality. So in that way, I think people spend 90+% of their time indoors, and so changes in outdoor air quality are affecting people inside as well, and so that that's where COBRA is that's what it's analyzing. But things like if you're changing stoves in someone's home and it changes air pollution within somebody's home, that's not covered in COBRA.
Got it. So again, kind of wonky here. So there was a question about what sorts of data inform the air pollution dispersion models for COBRA.
Yeah, good question. So the process of COBRA is you enter in changes in air pollution emissions at a county, and then there's this reduced form air pollution dispersion model that says, okay, how does change, if it's emitted in this county, how does it impact air pollution concentrations in all the other kind of neighboring counties and beyond. So the way that COBRA does that is a tool called the source receptor matrix, which is basically a matrix that says, if you reduced air pollution in this county, how does that impact concentrations in all other counties around it? And so it's this big, really, big matrix that says, what's the relationship between emissions and all these counties and all the receptor counties? That was developed, and it's getting pretty old now, but it was developed back in the 90s based on some air pollution, some more sophisticated air quality modeling from a model called the climatological CRDM, climatological regional dispersion model. So basically it was a lot of runs from a more sophisticated model to develop this kind of like relationship between emissions in a given county and air quality and receptor counties. And there are other more sophisticated air quality models out there today, things like CMAC and CAMEX, and they're kind of like Colby was talking about with the electricity models. There are kind of more sophisticated approaches, and COBRA is kind of that sort of middle path that's got this reduced form air quality model to kind of give a screening level result.
I'm going to take your word on all of that. So a couple of questions came in about the benefit per kilowatt, BPK. Can it consider, or does it consider energy storage, virtual power plants, things like demand response programs?
It does not explicitly have any of those types of programs. I would refer you to the methodology that's outlined in the technical report in terms of creating your own benefit per kilowatt hour value. But the preloaded values or the values that's in the spreadsheet of BPK reflect the standard resources that are in AVERT. And so that is the 2 different types of energy efficiency, 2 different types of wind, and 2 different types of solar. And so those are the values that are in BPK. But we would be interested in and would hope in some future edition to have more refined versions of that BPK value. But for now, we only have those 6 values.
There's a question, can BPK program, can it be used to justify something like a carbon pricing, or could it be used to determine indirect social and environmental costs associated with pollution?
I will offer an answer, and then I'll pass it to David. So the one thing that I'd really like to drive home is that the AVERT COBRA BPK pathway is looking only at health impacts from particulate matter, from fine particulate matter. It is not looking at any impacts that might come from climate change or impacts that might be derived from CO2. And so any social cost of carbon value that you might be interested in considering would be an adder to whatever BPK value or any COBRA value that you would be working with. There is, again, no representation of CO2 and CO2 impacts in COBRA and BPK. So insofar as using BPK as that value, I would say definitively no. Do not use the BPK as your social cost of carbon or any sort of climate change related impact that has a CO2 value. This would be fully in supplement of any other CO2 related metric that you would be working with. And I'll defer to David for any other information.
I agree with that. So there are other products out there that exist, like the social cost of carbon that the federal government uses to analyze policies that have changes in carbon emissions. And BPK is kind of a complement to that. So there's, the social cost of carbon, it tells you the benefits of reducing carbon emissions. BPK says at the same time, you're going to be reducing air pollution emissions, criteria pollutant emissions that are going to give you health benefits. What are the health benefits? And like Colby was saying, this is only looking at the health benefits associated with those air pollution emission reductions. But in terms of, how it can be used, so it's the kind of thing that can be used to analyze like the non-energy benefits of, renewable energy or energy efficiency projects. So, basically it's $1 per kilowatt hour value. And so if you say my energy efficiency program is going to save X number of kilowatt hours, you can then multiply that by this BPK number, and it'll tell you here's the dollar value of the benefits of that, of the health benefits associated with that program.
Okay, a couple of general questions I've seen come in. These are both free tools and available to everyone. Also, we are recording the webinar today, so we will be sending out, usually within a day, we send out slides and a recording, so folks will have access to this. Okay, back to some very specific questions. So this says COBRA is based on EPA's 2016 version 1 emissions modeling platform for baseline air quality. Any plans to update COBRA to reflect more recent platforms? Version 2 is available, and they say that EPA is preparing version 3.
Yeah, so that's, EPA is a big agency, and the part where Colby is based and is the state and local climate and energy program, and we've been, the part that does the emissions modeling platform is the Office of Air Quality Planning and Standards. We talk to them fairly regularly about kind of their plans for issuing new updates. Right now, their COBRA is based on this 2016 emissions modeling platform. They will be developing a new modeling platform with data that they're collecting from the year 2020 for the 2020 National Emissions Inventory. And I think probably when that modeling platform becomes available, we'll update it. It is, like I said, we try to update COBRA every roughly 2 to 3 years as new data comes available. And so I think the next modeling platform that comes out, we will use that to update COBRA.
Okay, another question about future plans. Any plans to capture upstream emissions from fossil fuel consumption in AVERT or in COBRA as well, I guess?
That's a good question. We don't have immediate plans to capture upstream emissions, thinking like refining or transportation of fuels or those sorts of things. But we are expanding resources, hopefully to include other modeling resources like electric vehicles or battery storage in AVERT. So we hope to expand perhaps the downstream and the down road emissions perhaps, but not the upstream emissions in the tool. So those emissions are more difficult to capture on a spatial resolution. Understanding if you change generation or emissions in certain regions, where are the upstream emissions coming from? So we are trying to capture geographies and spatial representations of emission changes in AVERT that would be very difficult to capture thinking about upstream emissions. So it's a very good question. In the near term, I don't think AVERT would be the tool for that sort of analysis, but we are hoping to add more resources and continue to expand functionality of AVERT. And
I'll just say for COBRA, the input to COBRA is emissions. So if you like AVERT is not going to give you emissions for upstream, emissions from energy. But if you had some other way of determining those upstream emissions and the locations, like Colby was saying, that's often tricky to do. But like where those emissions are occurring, that is the kind of thing you could put into COBRA and analyze what are the air quality and health impacts of those. But you have to find your own tool to do that.
Yeah. A couple more questions here, I think. One question was on I mentioned that the cost estimates on COBRA were very broad. There was like a range of 16 million to 38 million. So the question is, what is the distribution of the estimates? Are these the highs and lows at the tail end estimates or opposite ends of the T-stat, which I'm not a statistics person, so.
Yeah, good question. And it's not really technically a statistical distribution. What's happening there in COBRA, it gives you a high and a low value. And really what that is a sensitivity analysis. There are, I mentioned the way that we calculate the health impacts are these concentration response functions, which is like a function of the, relates how changes in air pollution and air quality result in changes in health outcomes. For each health outcome, there may be more than one function. So mortality, for example, right now in COBRA, there are sort of two different functions for mortality. There's one that says, for changing PM concentrations is going to result in a certain amount of mortality. And there's another function that says, no, it's actually going to be a little bit higher than that. And so what we do in COBRA is just basically report both numbers and say, this function said it was going to be this, and this function said it was going to be that. And we have the same dollar value that's associated with it. So it's not like there's a range in dollar values per avoided mortality. So that value is about roughly $10 million per avoided mortality. But the reason there's a high and a low value is just that there's two different ways to calculate avoided mortality, and we just provide both numbers. It's not technically a range, but it's often seen that way as saying, the number is sort of somewhere in between the high and the low value, but it's really kind of just two different ways of calculating it.
That's really helpful. So there's one last question. This is talking about how many emissions have especially high local health impacts. And since COBRA measures at the county level, the question is, would it be prudent to assume that COBRA underestimates some of these more localized harms? I guess it's asked that, or are these very localized harms kind of spread out across that area and accounted for in that way?
Good question. So I think that I don't think that we can necessarily assume that it's underestimating the local impacts, because let's say you've got 1 ton of emissions from a county. What COBRA is going to do is say some portion of that, and I think in most cases the majority of that pollution is going to stay in that county, and some portion of it is going to go into the next county and the next county and so on and so forth. So it just takes that 1 ton of emissions or whatever you've entered into COBRA and say some portion of that's going to stay here, some portion of it's going to go into other locations. And like I said, in most cases, the majority or the vast majority of those emissions are going to stay in COBRA. One thing that really influences that is where is it being released? Is it coming out of the ground level? Is it coming out of a smokestack that's 500 meters tall? So that COBRA accounts for that, and it impacts how those pollution gets dispersed. So I think that the majority of the emissions, the majority of the benefits tend to be close to the areas where the emission sources are. And then also the other thing that drives the results in COBRA is where the population centers are. So reducing a ton of emissions in downtown Manhattan gives you very different results than reducing a ton of emissions in rural Nebraska. Just because you have more people breathing cleaner air in New York City, you have a higher result, benefits from that. That said, COBRA is a county level resolution, and that sort of limits what you can do in terms of like neighborhood scale analyses and things like that. It's really kind of more of a macro scale tool to look at kind of regional changes and benefits.
Thanks. That was very helpful. And thank you both. We are just about out of time here, so we're going to cut off there. We got to almost all the questions and answered them in one way or another. So thank you both very much. This has been extremely informative and really appreciate you spending the time. Thanks everybody that attended today. I'm going to turn it over to Samantha to just talk about another webinar that we have coming up. So again, thank you so much.
Thanks. Thank you everyone. So on your screen now, you can see some information about a webinar that we have coming up in June. You can read about that on your screen, and you can also explore the topic of that webinar on the CEG website right now. So in this webinar on June 23rd, we will be talking about CEG's peaker plant mapping tool. We'll have some guest speakers from UPROSE and the Berkshire Environmental Action Team presenting on that. Really exciting topic and really cool tool that CEG put together. So you can read about that webinar at cleanegroup.org/webinars. And also, if you go to the CEG website, you can find that peaker power plant mapping tool and explore it prior to the webinar. So as we've mentioned at several points throughout today's webinar, we did record this. We will have slides and a recording posted soon, and we'll get those out to you via email. So thank you so much to our presenters. Thank you everyone who attended, and I hope to see you at our next webinar in June. Bye everyone.